Jesus does not love everyone, and I can prove why. This is the kind of statement that sends shivers down the spine of millions who were raised in pews, who bowed their heads before crucifixes, who whispered prayers believing in a universal message of love. Yet if we dare peel back the layers of what has been told to us for nearly 2,000 years, we discover a labyrinth of lies built by an institution more obsessed with power than with truth. And here is where the first explosive revelations begin. Because the story of Jesus most people think they know is not the story that was ever meant to be told. It was a crafted narrative, reshaped again and again to serve the needs of kings, emperors, bishops, and popes. And if you think that sounds outrageous, then brace yourself, because the 10 biggest lies the church told about Jesus are not just small embellishments, they are world-altering manipulations that turned a radical figure into a tool of obedience. And the first lie is the most fundamental of all. The lie that Jesus was born of a virgin in Bethlehem as a miraculous sign, when in reality the earliest gospel writers never even agreed on this story, with Mark, the oldest gospel, never mentioning any virgin birth, and Paul writing decades before never bringing it up either. It only appears later, when Matthew and Luke, writing in different regions, attempted to align the life of Jesus with prophecies from Isaiah, prophecies that, in the Hebrew, do not even speak of a virgin, but of a young woman. Yet this mistranslation was weaponized to give Jesus a divine entrance into the world, to elevate him above other men, and to root his legitimacy in a miraculous spectacle that would silence critics. But if the earliest sources did not believe this, then why did the church insist on repeating it endlessly, decorating it with nativity scenes, carols, and Christmas pageants? Because it was not about truth, but about control, to craft a supernatural beginning that locked believers into reverence from the very first breath of his life. And what does that mean for the millions who grew up believing the manger scene was history, when in fact it was myth? It means that their faith has been built on a false foundation, a lie presented as the cornerstone of hope. And yet this was only the beginning, because once you manipulate the start of a man's life, you can manipulate the rest. And the second lie is even more damaging, the lie that Jesus preached unconditional obedience to the church and its hierarchy. Because the truth is that the man we call Jesus, whether you see him as historical or symbolic, was a rebel against authority. He overturned tables of money changers. He called out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He challenged the rich and powerful. Yet what did the church do with this fiery radical? They transformed him into a passive lamb who accepts suffering silently and tells his followers to submit to priests and rulers, the very opposite of what he represented. Because in the original sayings attributed to him, preserved in fragments like the Gospel of Thomas, we see a teacher who empowered individuals to seek truth within themselves, not bow before institutions. But if the church allowed that message to stand, then people would never need the church itself. They would never need confession, indulgences, or papal decrees. So they lied, they altered sermons, they erased inconvenient gospels. They preached a Jesus who told you to listen to them rather than a Jesus who told you to listen to yourself. And this lie shaped centuries of submission. Monarchs justified their crowns, popes justified their wealth, priests justified their power, all on the back of a man who likely would have stood against them. So when you think of the cross hanging in cathedrals, ask yourself, was it really meant to symbolize love and obedience? Or was it meant to remind you to bow, to kneel, to surrender? Because every ritual, every liturgy, every carefully polished story was built to reinforce these lies. And if these first two are already making your heart race, then you need to prepare, because the deeper we go, the more shocking it becomes. We have only begun to uncover the cracks in the foundation, and already we see how mistranslation and manipulation turned a man into a myth and a rebel into a puppet. Imagine what other lies lie buried beneath centuries of dogma, lies that strike at the heart of resurrection, salvation, and even who Jesus really was. Because what if the man billions worship today is not the man who walked 2,000 years ago, but a carefully manufactured image designed to serve an empire? And if that is true, then the question you must ask yourself is this: do you want to keep believing what was handed to you? Or do you dare follow the trail of truth that might break the spell forever? Because once you see through the first lie, the rest begin to crumble like dominoes. And when they do, you cannot go back to blind faith. You can only go forward into truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. And that is why we are here, not to destroy hope, but to strip away illusions, so that whatever remains can finally be real. So keep watching, because the third lie will shake the very core of the resurrection story itself, and you will not believe how deep the deception runs. Now let us march deeper into the labyrinth, because the third lie is one that has been whispered for centuries as the cornerstone of Christianity, yet it is riddled with contradictions. The lie that Jesus physically rose from the dead on the third day in the exact manner the church preaches, a lie repeated in sermons, songs, and Easter celebrations. But when we peel back the layers of the Gospels, the resurrection accounts collapse under scrutiny. In one version, women arrive at the tomb and see an angel. In another, they see two men. In yet another, they see nothing but an empty tomb. And in some accounts, Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene, while in others to different disciples, and in still others not at all in the same way. And if this was the single most important miracle in human history, why would the witnesses not agree on basic details? Why would Paul, the earliest writer, speak only of visions and appearances rather than a physical encounter with an empty tomb? The answer is disturbing. The church needed to transform what may have been spiritual visions, grief-driven experiences, or symbolic retellings into a bodily resurrection story that could silence doubters, that could give Christianity an unshakable claim no other faith could match. So they shaped, altered, and insisted upon a literal bodily resurrection, when in reality the evidence shows diversity, confusion, and contradiction. Yet this lie became the beating heart of doctrine. But if the resurrection narrative is inconsistent, what else have they twisted? And here we find the fourth lie, the lie that Jesus preached eternal damnation in hell for those who disobeyed him, because the truth is that in the earliest layers of Scripture, Jesus spoke of Gehenna, a physical valley outside Jerusalem known for burning refuse, a vivid metaphor for judgment in this life and the destruction that came from sin and corruption. Yet the church turned this image into a fiery, eternal torture chamber, a concept reinforced over centuries with paintings, homilies, and fear tactics. Why? Because nothing controls human beings more than fear of eternal suffering. Nothing binds a community tighter to priests and sacraments than the terror of burning forever. But if Jesus himself never taught this in the way the church insists, then the very weapon they use to dominate billions is based on a falsehood. And think about the consequences. Children raised in fear, adults paralyzed by guilt, generations manipulated into obedience through the nightmare of a hell that was expanded far beyond its origins. Does that not sound like a calculated invention rather than divine revelation? Does it not strike you as the most effective tool of social engineering? The same institution that claimed to offer salvation first created the terror that salvation was supposed to rescue you from, a self-fulfilling cycle of fear and relief, lie and remedy. And if you can feel the weight of this manipulation, you are beginning to understand why we call these lies the biggest of all, because they did not just distort history, they distorted the souls of billions. And this is where we must pause and reflect. If resurrection itself is layered with contradictions, and if the eternal punishment preached in pulpits was magnified by the church, then how much of what you were taught is truly reliable, and how much of it was designed to keep you on your knees? Is it not time to open your eyes and see that the foundation of fear is not faith, but control? And is it not staggering to realize that entire empires were built on these deceptions, that kings and popes carved their power from a Jesus reshaped into what served them best? And as we continue this unraveling, the lies will grow even darker, because the next one questions not only what Jesus taught, but who he truly was. So prepare yourself, because once you hear it, you will never look at the figure on the stained glass windows the same way again. And now we arrive at the fifth lie, one so devastating that if accepted, it completely rewrites the very identity of the man the church forced billions to worship. The lie that Jesus was the literal Son of God in a way that no other human could ever be, a claim elevated in creeds enforced by councils and used as a dividing line between believers and heretics. Yet when we study the earliest texts, we find that Jesus himself never once declared this in the sense the church demands. In fact, in the Synoptic Gospels, he often calls himself the Son of Man, a Hebrew phrase tied to prophecy and humanity, not a declaration of cosmic uniqueness. And when John's Gospel finally declares Jesus the Word made flesh, it was written decades later, after layers of theology had already developed. So what does that tell us? That the idea of Jesus as divine was not his own proclamation, but the invention of men who needed to elevate him beyond question, because a mortal teacher could be debated, but a divine Son of God could never be challenged, and that is precisely what the Church wanted, to shut down any dissent. But if Jesus never saw himself as different from humanity in essence, then the core of Christian theology is a construction. And does that not mean that the billions who bowed down to him may have been bowing to an image carefully designed to control them? And here is where the sixth lie bursts forth, the lie that Jesus hated women and saw them as inferior, a lie perpetuated in centuries of sermons, laws, and restrictions where women were silenced, barred from leadership, and reduced to submissive roles. Yet in the fragments we do have, in Gospels buried for centuries, and in even the canonical accounts, we find Jesus breaking norms, speaking directly to women, elevating them as witnesses, defending them against stoning, and entrusting Mary Magdalene as the first to announce his resurrection. But the Church despised this narrative, because a faith where women had equal authority threatened the patriarchy of bishops. So they rewrote, they excluded, they twisted Paul's letters to silence women, they smeared Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, even though no scripture ever declared her such. Why? Because to erase her prominence was to erase the challenge she posed to male domination. And generation after generation, women were told that their submission was God's will, when in truth it was the will of men preserving their power. And when you realize this, when you recognize that half of humanity was suppressed by a lie projected onto the mouth of Jesus, does it not stir a deep anger? Does it not ignite in you the realization that the Church never served truth but only itself? And if the man they worshipped never spoke these things, then it means the true Jesus, whether symbolic or historical, was far closer to a liberator than a master, far closer to a breaker of chains than the maker of them. But this is what makes the lie so dangerous, because millions of women were forced into silence, obedience, and suffering under a structure that dared to claim divine authority. And when you step back and connect these dots, you see the pattern, from inventing divine birth to rewriting resurrection, from conjuring hell to enforcing obedience, from inflating divinity to erasing women. Each lie serves the same purpose, to elevate the Church while diminishing the people, to bind humanity in chains while pretending to offer freedom. And if that does not awaken you, then nothing will, because the lies we have already uncovered should be enough to make any thinking person ask, how much longer will I accept the story as handed to me? How much longer will I kneel before an altar built on deception? And yet the darkest lies are still to come, lies that will expose how the very crucifixion itself was rewritten, how history was scrubbed, how entire libraries of truth were burned to ash, so that one version of Jesus could dominate. And as we cross into that territory, you must be ready to let go of everything you thought you knew, because the seventh lie is about to strike at the very heart of sacrifice itself. And now we expose the seventh lie, the lie that Jesus willingly sacrificed himself on the cross as part of a cosmic plan orchestrated by God to save humanity, because when you examine the earliest layers of tradition, the crucifixion was not presented as a voluntary blood sacrifice, but as a brutal execution carried out by Rome against a man who posed a threat to order, a political killing dressed up by later writers as divine destiny. Yet the Church took this violent injustice and reframed it as the very will of God, insisting that Jesus came to die, that every lash of the whip and every nail driven into his flesh was part of a plan. But does that not transform God into a being who demands suffering to be appeased? Does that not turn the image of Jesus into that of a sacrificial lamb meant to placate divine wrath? And does that not strip away the power of his teachings, reducing him from a revolutionary voice to a pawn in a cosmic transaction? The truth is that early Christian communities debated the meaning of the crucifixion. Some saw it as martyrdom, others as tragedy, others as symbol, but the Church canonized one version, the sacrificial narrative, because it gave them leverage. If humanity was guilty by default and only absolved by the Church's mediation through the cross, then no one could escape their control. But if Jesus was executed as a rebel against oppression, then his death was not about appeasing God, but about exposing the cruelty of empire, and that truth was too dangerous to preserve, so the lie was elevated until it defined the faith. And that leads us to the eighth lie, the lie that the Gospels themselves are historical eyewitness accounts of what happened, because scholars know and history proves that the Gospels were written decades after the events, by communities shaping memory and theology, not by men standing at the foot of the cross scribbling down notes. Mark was written around 70 years after the supposed death of Jesus. Matthew and Luke copied and edited from Mark with their own agendas. John was written last, drenched in symbolism and theology, yet the church declared them historical, factual, inerrant, when in reality they contradict each other on nearly every major detail, from genealogies to sayings to resurrection appearances. But why insist they are eyewitness testimony? Because only then could they silence doubts. Only then could they demand that billions trust every word as literal. But if the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, then entire doctrines collapse. And if doctrines collapse, then the power of the church crumbles. So they protected the lie with threats of excommunication, with inquisitions, with executions, with centuries of censorship. But here is the reflection you must hold on to. If the very documents presented as divine are the product of human hands decades later, edited and polished to fit agendas, then what exactly is being worshipped? Is it Jesus the man, or is it Jesus the myth? And when you realize that these lies were constructed not in days but across centuries, does it not fill you with both anger and sorrow, because the faith of billions was manipulated to serve the few, and yet there is more, because the ninth lie, perhaps the most devastating of all, shows us how history itself was rewritten to make sure no alternative versions of Jesus survived. And if you think the lies so far have been dark, wait until you see how fire and sword were used to silence the truth forever. And now we reach the ninth lie, the lie that the church preserved all the true records of Jesus, when in fact it systematically destroyed competing voices, burned libraries, and declared heretical any community that dared present a different picture of who Jesus was. Because in the earliest centuries there were dozens of gospels circulating, the Gospel of Thomas with its cryptic sayings pointing to inner enlightenment, the Gospel of Mary that gave women authority, the Gospel of Judas that reframed betrayal as part of a hidden plan. Yet what did the church do? It banned them, buried them, hunted down their readers, until by the 4th century under the rule of Constantine the canon was locked and sealed, a curated story of Jesus chosen, not because it was truer but because it was useful to empire. And in doing so the church committed the ninth lie, convincing generations that what survived was the complete truth, when in reality it was the censored edition of a much larger and more diverse tradition. But the 10th and final lie is perhaps the boldest, the lie that Jesus founded the very institution of the church itself, that he appointed bishops, priests, and popes to rule forever, when in fact no such structure existed in his time. The communities that followed him were small, often leaderless gatherings that debated fiercely and interpreted freely. Yet centuries later, the church declared that its hierarchy was instituted directly by Jesus, a retroactive claim used to give divine legitimacy to their authority. But if Jesus never founded the church, then the entire edifice of cathedrals, papacies, and dogmas rests on fiction. And does that not mean that millions have been submitting to a power structure that claimed divine origin it never possessed? Now pause for a moment and feel the weight of these 10 lies together. The virgin birth, the obedience, the resurrection, the hell, the divinity, the suppression of women, the sacrificial crucifixion, the eyewitness. Gospel claim, the preservation of truth, and the foundation of the church, each one a link in a chain binding humanity to an institution that rewrote history. And if your heart is racing now, it should be, because to realize that the Jesus you were told to worship was not the Jesus who walked the earth is to feel the ground shake beneath your feet, but it is also liberating, because if the lies fall away, then what remains is the possibility of truth unchained, a chance to rediscover the teachings of a man who challenged power rather than upheld it, a chance to recognize that hope does not come from obedience to lies, but from courage to seek reality. And if these revelations shook you, then you must understand this is only the beginning. For every suppressed gospel there are truths waiting to be uncovered. For every lie exposed there are deeper questions to be asked. So if you are ready to keep walking this path with me, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, because together we will keep uncovering the lies, the manipulations, and the secrets that shaped the faith of billions, and you will not want to miss what comes next.